It's a hot morning on the banks of the Nile, and a young woman named Merritt hasn't felt right for 2 weeks. No morning sickness apps, no little plastic stick from a pharmacy. So she walks to the edge of her mud brick house, crouches over two small cloth bags, one full of barley, one full of wheat, and she pees on them, then she waits. Because in ancient Egypt, that soggy little bag of grain was the world's first pregnancy test. And here's the part that'll break your brain. 500 years later, scientists tried it in a lab. It actually worked. So what did the ancient Egyptians actually do when someone got pregnant? How did they know? Who helped them? And what did they do when the baby finally came? In a world with no hospitals, no doctors as we'd recognize them, and a very real chance that neither mother nor child would survive the night. Turns out, the answer is way more interesting than you'd think. Let's step inside their world. If you love this kind of history, hit subscribe. Okay, back to ancient Egypt. Picture the village of Deir el Medina 3,000 years ago. It's a tight little grid of mud brick homes on the edge of the desert, where the workers who carved the tombs of the pharaohs lived with their families. Narrow streets, flat rooftops for sleeping, goats, kids everywhere, and in almost every home, at almost any time, someone was pregnant. Because here's the thing you have to understand about ancient Egypt. Children weren't just wanted. They were everything. In a world with no retirement plan, no hospitals, and no social safety net, your children were your future. They worked the fields, carried on your name, and, in a culture obsessed with the afterlife, they were the ones who would keep your memory alive after you died. To an Egyptian, being forgotten was a kind of second death. Children were how you cheated it. So a pregnancy wasn't a private little secret. It was a big deal for the whole household, and the pressure was enormous. We have actual letters and prayers from ancient Egypt where women beg the gods for a child. There are fertility figurines, small clay statues of women, left as offerings at shrines, worn smooth by anxious hands. Now here's where it gets tricky. In a world before ultrasounds and blood tests, how do you even know you're pregnant? Today you glance at a stick on your bathroom counter. Back then, you had a missed cycle, a strange feeling, maybe some nausea, and a whole lot of uncertainty. For weeks, maybe months, a woman simply wouldn't know for sure. And that uncertainty drove the Egyptians, who were genuinely brilliant observers of the human body, to come up with tests. Real, written down, step-by-step tests. We know this because they wrote them on medical papyri that survive to this day. The oldest of them, the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus, dates to around 1800 BC. That's the oldest known medical text in the world dedicated to women's health. Older than the pyramids of Giza? No. But older than King Tut, older than Moses, older than the Trojan War. So imagine your Merritt, standing in your home in that dusty village, hand on your stomach, wondering. You can't call a doctor, you can't buy a test, but your grandmother knows things. The women of the village know things. And some of those things were written down by Egyptian physicians over 1,000 years before Hippocrates was even born. So what did they actually do? Now, you'd think ancient people had absolutely no idea how any of this worked. That pregnancy was pure mystery, all superstition and prayers to the moon. Actually, wrong. And this is where the Egyptians start to surprise you. Were they completely right about the human body? No, not even close. They believed a woman's insides were basically a system of open tubes and channels, connecting everything from her mouth to her womb. Which is why some of their fertility tests sound completely bananas at first. But here's the twist. Some of those bananas tests were built on a real observation. That the body is connected, that what happens in one place shows up in another. They just didn't have the anatomy to explain why. Take the fertility test from that Kahun papyrus. To find out if a woman could conceive, they'd place a clove of garlic or an onion deep inside her overnight. The next morning, they'd check her breath. If they could smell the onion on her breath, the channels were clear, she was fertile. If not, something was blocked. Now picture a modern doctor hearing that and rolling their eyes. Onion breath? Come on. But pause for a second. The underlying idea, that you can test whether internal passages are open by seeing if a substance travels through the body, isn't actually insane. It's wrong about the plumbing, but it's a real attempt at a diagnostic test. Observation, hypothesis, result. That's the skeleton of science, scratched onto papyrus in 1800 BC. And here's the visual I want you to hold on to. Somewhere in a temple or a physician's home, an Egyptian doctor, probably a man, but working from knowledge passed down through generations of women, is grinding herbs by lamplight, dictating these instructions to a scribe who presses them into wet papyrus with a reed pen. The ink is black soot and water. The room smells of crushed onion and incense. And what he's writing down will still exist, still be readable, nearly 4,000 years later. So no, the Egyptians weren't stumbling in the dark. They were observers. Careful, curious, a little bit wrong, and occasionally astonishingly right. And nowhere is that more true than with the test Merritt is about to take, the one with the bags of grain. Because that one actually worked. Here's how we know. Let's go back to Merritt and her two little bags. Here's the actual instruction, preserved on a document called the Berlin Medical Papyrus, written down over 3,000 years ago. To test for pregnancy, a woman was told to urinate every day on two cloth bags, one holding barley, the other holding emmer wheat. Then you watch and you wait. If the grain sprouts, the papyrus says, she is pregnant. If nothing grows at all, she is not. Simple, elegant, and genuinely testable. Picture it. Merritt sets her two bags on the flat roof of her house, where the desert sun can reach them. Every morning she waters them the only way the recipe requires. And every morning she climbs back up to check, scanning the damp grain for that first tiny green thread pushing up toward the light. Her mother checks with her. A neighbor leans over the low wall to ask. Days pass. The whole household is watching two bags of seeds like the world's slowest, strangest scoreboard. And then, a sprout, pale green, curling up out of the wet barley. In Merritt's world, that little shoot means a new life is coming. Now, the papyrus doesn't stop there. It makes a bolder claim. If the barley sprouts first, it said, the child will be a boy. If the emmer wheat sprouts first, a girl. So this one soggy bag was doing double duty, pregnancy test and gender reveal. 3,500 years before anyone thought to bake a cake with blue frosting inside. Here's what I love about this. It's not a spell. There's no god you have to pray to, no magic word. It's a procedure. Do this, wait, observe the result, read the meaning. It looks honestly a lot like something you'd find in a modern lab notebook. Crude, yes, but the shape of it is pure experiment. Which raises the obvious question. The one that's been sitting in the back of your mind since the start of this video. Did it work? Could a bag of wet seeds really tell a woman she was pregnant? Or did generations of Egyptian women just get lucky, reading meaning into random sprouts? For thousands of years, nobody knew. And then, in the middle of the 20th century, some scientists decided to find out. So here's what happened. In 1963, researchers decided to actually run the ancient Egyptian grain test in a controlled setting, not with magic, with biology. The idea is this. A pregnant woman's body is flooded with elevated hormones, including higher levels of estrogen. Those hormones pass out of the body in her urine, and it turns out that when you pour hormone-rich urine on seeds, it can affect whether and how fast they sprout. So the question wasn't crazy at all. It was, is there something in a pregnant woman's urine that behaves differently on grain? When the test was run, the results were striking. In a majority of cases, the urine of pregnant women did cause the grain to sprout. And here's the kicker. The urine of women who were not pregnant and of men tended not to trigger that growth. Estimates from the experiment put the accuracy of detecting a pregnancy somewhere around 70%. 70%. From a test invented in the Bronze Age, using nothing but pea and seeds. Now, let's be clear and fair, because accuracy matters. The part where the grain predicts the baby's sex, barley for a boy, wheat for a girl, that part didn't hold up. When scientists checked, it was no better than a coin flip. So the Egyptians got the big thing shockingly right, and the bonus feature completely wrong. But think about what shockingly right means here. 3,000 years before we understood hormones, before we knew estrogen existed, before we had microscopes or chemistry, an Egyptian physician noticed that something in a pregnant woman's body could make seeds behave differently, and they built a repeatable test around it. Here's the modern parallel that gets me. The first reliable pregnancy tests of the early 20th century, the ones our great-grandmothers used, also worked by detecting pregnancy hormones in urine. They just used lab animals instead of grain. In other words, the core insight, hormones in urine reveal pregnancy, was correct in ancient Egypt, correct in 1930, and it's still the principle behind the plastic stick in your bathroom today. The Egyptians were on the right track 4,000 years early. They just ran the experiment with barley on a rooftop instead of a strip of chemically treated paper. And when you put it like that, Merritt crouching over her two little bags doesn't look primitive at all. She looks like the first page of a very long science story, one that ends with you staring at two pink lines. But knowing you were pregnant was only the beginning, because now you had to survive it. And in ancient Egypt, that meant calling in reinforcements. Not just human ones, but divine ones. Here's where it gets wonderfully strange. Egyptian mothers-to-be didn't turn to the big famous gods you've heard of. They turned to two of the weirdest looking deities in the entire Egyptian pantheon, and they loved them for it. The first is Taweret. Imagine a goddess with the head of a hippopotamus, the legs of a lion, the back of a crocodile, and the swollen belly of a pregnant woman standing upright. That's Taweret. To us, she looks like a monster stitched together from a nightmare. To an expecting Egyptian mother, she was the fiercest, most comforting protector imaginable. Because a mother hippo is one of the most dangerous, aggressive animals in all of Africa. You want something guarding your pregnancy? You want the thing that even crocodiles are scared of. The second is Bez. Bez is a stubby little dwarf god with a lion's mane, a stuck-out tongue, and a grinning, almost goofy face. And Egyptians put his image everywhere a baby might be. On beds, on headrests, on the walls of the room where women gave birth. His job was to scare away evil spirits and protect mothers and children, and he did it by being loud and ugly and funny. Basically, the world's first nightlight monster, the good kind, the one that keeps the bad things away. Picture a pregnant woman's world filling up with these two. A little Bess amulet strung around her neck on a cord of faience beads. A Taweret figurine tucked by her bed. Images of both painted onto the wooden headrest she sleeps on. We've even found tattoos, real ink, on the preserved skin of Egyptian mummies, of the god Bez, marked on the thighs and lower bodies of some women, right where they might have wanted protection during childbirth. Think about that for a second. A woman, 3,500 years ago, choosing to get a protective tattoo before giving birth. If that doesn't collapse the distance between her world and ours, I don't know what does. She was scared. She wanted her baby to live, so she covered herself in guardians, seen and unseen, and got ready for the hardest night of her life. So the day comes. And here's the first thing that'll surprise you. In ancient Egypt, nobody lay down flat on their back to give birth. That's a much more modern idea. An Egyptian woman gave birth crouching, kneeling, or squatting, often supported on a very specific object called a birth brick. A birth brick was a large mud brick, and a woman in labor would place her feet on two of them, or squat over them, using gravity to help bring the baby down. And these weren't plain bricks. In 2001, archaeologists digging at the ancient city of Abydos found one, an actual birth brick, around 3,700 years old, and it was painted. On its surface was a scene of a mother holding her newborn child, flanked by figures of protective gods and the goddess Hathor. This was the only painted birth brick ever found, and it turned a piece of medical equipment into a small, beautiful prayer. Now picture the room. There are no men here. Egyptian childbirth was a women's world. The mother was surrounded by female relatives, neighbors, and experienced women who acted as midwives. There was no formal medical degree for this. The knowledge lived in the women themselves. Passed hand to hand across generations, they knew how to position the mother, how to massage, what herbs to burn, what words to chant. They rubbed the mother's belly with oils. They recited spells calling on Bes and Taweret and Hathor to hurry the birth and keep the demons away. The air in that room would have been thick, incense smoke, the smell of oil and sweat, the low sound of women's voices chanting in the lamplight. Someone holds the mother from behind. Someone kneels in front, ready to catch. And on the wall, the grinning face of Bes watches over all of it. And I have to be honest with you about the stakes, because this is where the humor stops. Childbirth in the ancient world was dangerous. Genuinely, frighteningly dangerous. For the mother and the baby both. Infection, complications, and blood loss, with no way to treat them, killed many women. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. A large share of children died before their first birthday. Every one of those amulets, every prayer, every painted brick, they weren't decoration. They were hope, pressed up against a real and constant fear. These women were brave in a way that's easy to forget when you're laughing at a hippo goddess. And then, if all went well, the baby arrives. And here's where you feel just how human these people were. The Egyptians didn't rush to name a baby or celebrate too loudly, because those first days were the most fragile. But once a child took hold on life, that child was adored. We know Egyptian mothers breastfed their babies for a long time, often up to 3 years. And it wasn't only about food. They understood in their own way that a long nursing period helped space out pregnancies and kept the baby healthy. Mothers carried their infants in slings against their bodies while they worked, ground grain, and walked to the river the same way parents wear their babies today. There's a surviving piece of Egyptian writing, a scribe's advice to his student, that tells the young man to honor his mother, to remember that she carried him, that she nursed him for 3 years without complaint, that she put him in school and waited for him every day. Read that again. It's a father, thousands of years ago, telling his son, don't forget everything your mother did for you. That's not ancient. That's a text message you could send tomorrow. And that's the thing that stays with me about all of this. Strip away the hippo goddess and the onion test and the bags of grain, and what you're left with is painfully familiar. A young woman, anxious, hoping she's pregnant or hoping she isn't. A family holding its breath. A frightening night, a room full of people who love her, and then a tiny new person who changes everything. The technology was different. The fear, the hope, the love, exactly the same. Their divine mother, Isis, was shown cradling and nursing her baby son, Horus. An image so tender, it was later echoed for thousands of years in completely different religions. Because some images are just true. A mother, a child, a moment of holding on. The Egyptians carved it in stone because they knew, even then, that this was the most important thing that ever happens to anybody. So next time you see a friend nervously holding a little plastic stick, waiting for 2 lines to appear, remember Merit, crouched on her rooftop by the Nile, watering 2 bags of seeds, watching for a single green sprout to tell her that her whole life was about to change. 3,500 years apart, doing exactly the same thing, reading the future in whatever tools they had. She had barley, you have a pharmacy. But the hope in the chest is identical. The ancient Egyptians didn't have our machines. What they had was attention, a stubborn, careful curiosity about their own bodies that got them shockingly close to the truth. Thousands of years early, they watched, they tested, they wrote it down. And a piece of that is still with us. Every single time someone finds out they're going to be a parent. If you learned something, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. Which surprised you more, the grain test actually working, or the hippo goddess? Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.